Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Candlelight Murder at Willow House, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome, dear listeners, to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, your narrator for this evening's tale of deception and detection. Tonight we follow the renowned Belgian detective Hercule Poirot as he unravels a most perplexing case, one where darkness itself becomes both weapon and witness. Chapter 1. When Darkness Falls. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Willow House as 6 guests gathered in the dining room of Lady Margaret Ashworth's country estate. The year was 1934, and the shadows of uncertainty that plagued Europe seemed to have followed the dinner party indoors. Candles flickered in the ornate silver candelabra, casting dancing shadows across the mahogany table where the evening's players had assembled. Poirot himself was among the guests, having been invited by Lady Ashworth after a chance meeting at the Royal Opera House. The little Belgian detective sat with his characteristic precision, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly as he observed his fellow diners with those penetrating green eyes that missed nothing. Lady Margaret Ashworth, their hostess, sat at the head of the table, a striking woman in her 50s with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. She wore a burgundy velvet dress, and her late husband's family emeralds, which caught the candlelight magnificently. To her right sat Dr. Edmund Blackwood, the family physician, a portly gentleman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His nervous habit of adjusting his watch chain had become more pronounced as the evening progressed. Across from Dr. Blackwood, Mrs. Vivian Harrington commanded attention with her theatrical gestures and rich voice. A retired actress of considerable renown, she regaled the table with stories from her days on the London stage. Her companion for the evening was her secretary, Miss Julia Pemberton, a quiet young woman whose sharp intelligence was evident in her dark eyes, though she spoke little. The final guest was Captain James Fortescue, a weathered military man who had served with Lady Ashworth's late husband in India. His ramrod posture and clipped manner of speaking suggested years of military discipline, though Poirot noted how his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his wine-glass. The conversation had grown increasingly tense as the evening wore on. Mrs. Harrington had been regaling them with theatrical anecdotes when she made a rather pointed comment about people who live beyond their means. The remark seemed directed at their hostess, though it was delivered with the actress's trademark smile. Some of us, Lady Ashworth had replied coolly, prefer to maintain certain standards regardless of temporary financial difficulties. Blackwood had attempted to change the subject by mentioning his recent investments, while Captain Fortescue muttered something about modern morality under his breath. Miss Pemberton simply watched everything with those observant eyes of hers, making mental notes as was her professional habit. Poirot absorbed every nuance of conversation, every glance, every gesture. He sensed undercurrents of tension that ran deeper than mere social awkwardness. There were secrets at this table, secrets that some were desperate to keep hidden. As the grandfather clock in the corner struck 9, Lady Ashworth rose to ring for the next course. She had just reached for the silver bell when the lights suddenly failed. The electric illumination vanished instantly, leaving only the warm glow of candles to light the room. How tiresome! Lady Ashworth's voice came from the darkness near the sideboard. The electrical system has been unreliable lately. Please everyone, remain seated. I'll light some additional candles. For perhaps 30 seconds the room was filled only with the soft rustling of fabric and the occasional scrape of a chair. Someone coughed nervously. Poirot sat perfectly still, his exceptional hearing attuned to every sound, cataloguing each movement, each breath. Then came the crash, the unmistakable sound of the heavy silver candelabra falling to the floor, followed immediately by a woman's sharp cry of pain that cut off abruptly. Lady Ashworth, Dr. Blackwood's voice called out with professional concern. More sounds of movement, a chair scraping back, footsteps on the Persian carpet. Mrs. Harrington's voice, high with alarm. What's happened, Margaret? Stay where you are, everyone. Captain Fortescue commanded with military authority. I'll find the emergency lighting. But it was Poirot who moved first, his small figure navigating the darkened room with surprising agility. He found Lady Ashworth collapsed beside the fallen candelabra, her emeralds scattered across the floor like green tears in the candlelight. Dr. Blackwood was already kneeling beside her, his experienced hands checking for signs of life. I'm afraid, he said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow and professional certainty, Lady Ashworth is dead. The silence that followed was broken only by Miss Pemberton's sharp intake of breath and the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Outside, the rain continued its relentless rhythm against the windows, as if nature itself was keeping time for the tragedy that had just unfolded. Poirot's eyes glittered in the candlelight as he surveyed the scene. Already his methodical mind was working, filing away details that others might overlook. The way the candelabra had fallen, the position of the body, the scattered emeralds, each element would prove crucial in unraveling the truth. The game, as they say, was afoot. Chapter 2: The Scene of Shadows. When Captain Fortescue finally located the emergency lanterns in the hall cupboard, their harsh white light revealed a scene that would remain etched in every witness's memory. Lady Margaret Ashworth lay motionless beside the ornate sideboard, her burgundy dress spread around her like spilled wine. The silver candelabra, a family heirloom that had graced countless dinner parties, lay twisted beside her, its candles extinguished and scattered. Poirot knelt beside Dr. Blackwood, who was conducting his examination with the thoroughness of long medical experience. The detective's sharp eyes took in every detail: the way Lady Ashworth's emerald necklace had broken, sending stones across the Persian carpet like fallen stars, the position of her hands, one reaching toward the bell she had been trying to ring, the angle at which her body had fallen. The cause of death appears to be a severe blow to the head, Dr. Blackwood announced grimly, removing his spectacles to clean them with shaking hands. The edge of the candelabra has blood on it. She must have struck it as she fell. Mrs. Harrington pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her usual theatrical composure cracking. How absolutely dreadful. Poor Margaret. But surely it was an accident. She must have stumbled in the darkness. Miss Pemberton stood frozen near her chair, her notebook still clutched in her hands, a detail that Poirot filed away with interest. Why would a secretary bring her notebook to a dinner party? Captain Fortescue had assumed command of the situation with military efficiency. The telephone lines appear to be down, likely the same storm that affected the electricity. I'll ride to the village to fetch the constable, but it will take time in this weather. If I may, Poirot interjected gently, his accent more pronounced in the gravity of the moment. Perhaps it would be wise to preserve the scene exactly as it is until the authorities arrive, and I suggest we all remain together in the drawing room. Dr. Blackwood looked up sharply. Surely you don't suspect foul play, Monsieur Poirot? In the darkness, anyone might have stumbled, but Poirot was already circling the room, his keen gaze cataloguing details. He paused at each dinner chair, noting their positions, examining the carpet for any disturbance. When he reached Mrs. Harrington's place, he stopped and crouched down, studying something on the floor. Curious, he murmured, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. Very curious indeed. What have you found? Miss Pemberton asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot held up a small object between his thumb and forefinger, a piece of candle wax still soft and malleable. This was not here when we sat down to dinner. The candles on the table have burned steadily in their holders all evening, yet here is fresh wax, newly dropped. Mrs. Harrington's hand flew to her throat. What are you suggesting? I suggest nothing, madame. I merely observe. Poirot carefully wrapped the wax in his handkerchief and placed it in his pocket. But I note that someone in this room moved during the darkness, moved enough to disturb a candle. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Each guest looked at the others with new suspicion, the comfortable familiarity of the dinner party evaporating like morning mist. Captain Fortescue cleared his throat. With respect, Monsieur Poirot, we were all seated when the lights failed. Lady Ashworth was the only one who stood up to light additional candles as she said. Any of us might have bumped the table in the confusion. Indeed, Poirot agreed mildly, yet the wax fell not near the table, but by your chair, Madame Harrington. And observe, he gestured toward the dining table, where the candles remained perfectly upright in their holders, their wax intact. These candles show no disturbance whatsoever. Mrs. Harrington's face had gone pale beneath her rouge. Are you accusing me of murder? That's preposterous. I never left my seat. I accuse no one, madame, but someone did leave their seat. Someone moved through this room in the darkness with purpose and certainty. Someone who perhaps knew exactly where to find Lady Ashworth in the dark. Dr. Blackwood struggled to his feet, his face grave. Monsieur Poirot, these are serious allegations. What possible motive could any of us have for harming Lady Ashworth? Poirot's eyes glittered in the lamplight. Ah, mon ami, that is precisely what we must discover, for I am convinced that our hostess's death was no accident. Someone at this table planned her murder, used the darkness as cover, and expected us all to believe it was a tragic mishap. He walked to the windows, where the rain continued its steady assault against the glass. The storm provided the perfect opportunity, the electrical failure, the darkness, the isolation. But murder, like any performance, requires not just opportunity, but also motive and means. Miss Pemberton spoke up, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. You speak of this as a performance, Monsieur Poirot. Do you believe it was rehearsed? An excellent question, mademoiselle. And yes, I begin to think that this evening's events were planned with the precision of a theatrical production. Someone knew exactly what would happen when the lights failed. Someone was prepared. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, its deep tones echoing through the suddenly oppressive room. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and inside Willow House, a killer sat among them, waiting to see if their perfect plan would hold under the scrutiny of Hercule Poirot. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Lamplight. The drawing-room of Willow House had always been Lady Ashworth's pride, a symphony of cream silk wallpaper, Persian rugs, and carefully arranged antiques that spoke of generations of refined taste. Now, under the harsh glare of emergency lanterns, it felt more like an interrogation chamber, where 5 survivors and 1 detective waited for dawn and the arrival of official authority. Poirot had arranged the chairs in a precise semicircle, positioning himself where he could observe each guest clearly. The little Belgian sat with his hands folded, his green eyes moving methodically from face to face, reading the subtle languages of guilt, fear, and deception that people spoke without realizing it. Mrs. Harrington had claimed the large wingback chair nearest the fireplace, her theatrical training evident in how she composed herself despite the circumstances. Yet Poirot noticed how her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching, and how she kept glancing toward the door as if planning an escape route. Perhaps, she said with forced lightness, we should discuss more pleasant things while we wait. Speaking of the dead seems rather morbid. On the contrary, Poirot replied gently, I find that speaking of the dead often reveals much about the living. Lady Ashworth was your friend, was she not, madame? A shadow crossed Mrs. Harrington's face. Margaret and I had known each other for many years, yes, since before her marriage in fact. And yet this evening, there seemed to be some tension between you. Nonsense. Margaret simply had strong opinions about financial responsibility. We didn't always agree on such matters. Dr. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair. If we're discussing Margaret's financial situation, I feel I should mention that she had consulted me recently about selling some of her jewelry, the emerald necklace she wore tonight, specifically. This revelation hung in the air like morning fog. Miss Pemberton looked up sharply from her notebook, where she had been making quiet notations throughout the conversation. Selling her emeralds. Captain Fortescue leaned forward, his military bearing making him seem like he was conducting a briefing. Good God, were things that bad? Her husband left her quite well provided for, I thought. Investments can go wrong, Dr. Blackwood said carefully. Particularly in these uncertain times, Margaret had made some unfortunate choices with her late husband's portfolio. Poirot's eyebrows raised delicately. And who advised her on these investments, Doctor? Well, I may have recommended a few opportunities, nothing risky, mind you, conservative investments that should have been perfectly safe. Mrs. Harrington's laugh had a bitter edge. Conservative, Edmund, dear, your conservative investments have lost half their value in the past year. Ask anyone who was foolish enough to follow your advice. That's quite enough. Dr. Blackwood's face flushed red. I never guaranteed anything. Investment always carries risk. Indeed it does, Poirot observed mildly. And when investments fail, people sometimes become desperate. Tell me, Doctor, how much money did Lady Ashworth lose on your recommendations? Before Dr. Blackwood could answer, Miss Pemberton spoke up. Approximately £15,000. Plus the interest from her husband's trust fund, which was tied to the same investments. All eyes turned to the young secretary. She closed her notebook with a snap, her composure absolute despite the attention. You seem remarkably well informed about your employer's finances, Poirot noted with interest. Mrs. Harrington asked me to research Lady Ashworth's financial situation several months ago. She was considering a business proposition, and wanted to know if Lady Ashworth was a suitable partner. Mrs. Harrington's face went white. Julia, you really shouldn't. What sort of business proposition? Poirot interrupted smoothly. Miss Pemberton glanced at her employer, then continued with quiet determination. Mrs. Harrington wanted to start a theatrical production company. She needed a silent partner with social connections and available capital. When she learned of Lady Ashworth's difficulties, she proposed that Lady Ashworth sell her emeralds and invest the proceeds in the company, which would naturally require Mrs. Harrington to manage the funds. Captain Fortescue observed dryly. How convenient. How dare you? Mrs. Harrington shot to her feet, her careful composure finally cracking. I offered Margaret a legitimate business opportunity. If she was too proud or too foolish to accept help from an old friend, help. Dr. Blackwood stood as well, his medical bag clutched in one hand. Vivian, you were trying to separate Margaret from the last valuable things she owned. You knew she was desperate. Gentlemen, madame, please. Poirot raised a small hand, and somehow the gesture commanded immediate attention. We accomplish nothing with accusations. Let us instead consider the facts as they stand. He began to pace slowly around the semicircle of chairs, his hands clasped behind his back. Lady Ashworth was in financial difficulty. Dr. Blackwood, her trusted adviser, had inadvertently cost her a considerable sum. Mrs. Harrington proposed a business venture that would require Lady Ashworth to sell her most precious possessions. And tonight, those very emeralds lay scattered across the dining room floor. You think someone killed her for the emeralds? Miss Pemberton asked. I think, Poirot said carefully, that someone killed her to prevent her from doing something. But what that something was, we have yet to discover. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, its sound echoing through the house like a funeral bell. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, trapping them all in this web of secrets and suspicion, until dawn brought the constable and the harsh light of official inquiry. But Poirot suspected that by then, the truth would already be revealed. The killer among them was growing nervous, and nervous people made mistakes. All he had to do was wait for the right moment to spring his trap. Chapter 4: The Weight of Silence. The fire in the drawing room hearth had burned low, casting shifting shadows that seemed to give life to the portraits of long-dead Ashworths hanging on the walls. Their painted eyes appeared to watch the living with silent judgment, witnesses to a tragedy that would soon join the family's darker chapters. Poirot had grown quiet, allowing the uncomfortable silence to stretch like a taut wire. He understood that silence often accomplished what direct questioning could not. It forced people to fill the void with words they had not intended to speak. Captain Fortescue was the first to crack. "This waiting is intolerable," he declared, rising from his chair with military precision. "I should ride to the village regardless of the weather. This storm can't last forever." "On the contrary, mon capitaine," Poirot replied without looking up from his contemplation of the fireplace. "I believe the storm serves our purposes quite well. Sometimes truth emerges more readily when escape is impossible." Miss Pemberton set down her teacup with a delicate clink. "Monsieur Poirot, you speak as if you already know who killed Lady Ashworth." "Do I? Perhaps I merely suspect that the killer has been very clever, but not quite clever enough." He turned to face the group, his green eyes bright with intelligence. "Tell me, mademoiselle, in your observations of this household, did you notice anything unusual about Lady Ashworth's behavior recently?" The young secretary considered carefully before answering. She had been receiving telephone calls that upset her greatly. Always in the evenings after the servants had retired, she would take them in her private study and emerge looking quite distressed. Mrs. Harrington shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret never mentioned any troubling calls to me. Perhaps Dr. Blackwood suggested they concerned her financial difficulties. Creditors can be most persistent." "No." Miss Pemberton shook her head firmly. "These calls began before the investment losses became apparent. I noted them in my diary because Mrs. Harrington had asked me to document Lady Ashworth's routine for the business proposal." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "You kept a diary of Lady Ashworth's activities. How very thorough. And what did these notations reveal?" "The calls always came on Tuesday evenings precisely at 9 o'clock. Lady Ashworth would dismiss the servants early on those nights and take the call in private. Afterward, she would often walk in the garden, regardless of the weather." "The garden?" Captain Fortescue frowned. "In the dark? That seems unlike Margaret. She was always careful about her safety." Which suggests, Poirot mused, that these conversations were of such import that she needed time alone to consider their implications. "Tell me, Miss Pemberton, when did these calls cease?" 3 weeks ago. The Tuesday before last, there was no call. Lady Ashworth waited in her study until nearly 11, but the telephone never rang." Dr. Blackwood pulled out his pocket watch, a gesture that Poirot had noticed him repeat throughout the evening. "I should mention that Margaret had been asking questions about certain legal matters recently. Hypothetical questions, she claimed, about inheritance and will requirements." "What sort of questions?" Mrs. Harrington demanded, her voice sharp with sudden interest. "Whether a will could be contested if the testator was under duress, whether gifts made shortly before death might be considered invalid, that sort of thing." A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames like skeletal fingers seeking entry. Captain Fortescue cleared his throat. "I say, that puts rather a different complexion on things, doesn't it? If Margaret was considering changing her will, then someone might have had a very good reason to want her dead before she could do so." Poirot finished quietly. "An excellent observation, mon capitaine." Mrs. Harrington's face had gone quite pale. "You're all being ridiculous. Margaret's will is a private matter, and besides, she would hardly discuss such things with her doctor." "Unless," Dr. Blackwood said slowly, "she needed medical testimony about her mental competence." In cases where undue influence is suspected, a physician's assessment can be crucial. Miss Pemberton spoke up suddenly. There's something else. Lady Ashworth asked me to type a letter for her last week. She said it was to her solicitor in London, but she sealed it herself and posted it personally. She seemed quite anxious that it reach him quickly. Poirot moved to the window, peering out at the storm-lashed garden. In the distance, a single light flickered in what appeared to be the gardener's cottage. Most illuminating, he murmured. A pattern begins to emerge, does it not? Lady Ashworth was clearly preparing for something, some action that required legal counsel and medical evaluation. The question becomes who knew of her intentions and who stood to lose by them. He turned back to face the group, his expression grave. I suggest that our hostess's death was not the result of a moment's opportunity during the electrical failure. Rather, it was the culmination of a plan that had been developing for weeks, possibly months. That's a very serious accusation, Captain Fortescue said stiffly. Murder, mon ami, is a very serious crime. And this murder was committed by someone who knew this house well, someone who could navigate in darkness, someone who understood exactly when and how to strike. The grandfather clock chimed 1 o'clock, its deep notes seeming to echo from the grave itself. In the growing chill of the early morning hours, each guest withdrew into their own thoughts, contemplating the possibility that they sat in the presence of a killer. But Poirot's mind was already racing ahead, connecting details, following the threads of motive and opportunity to their inevitable conclusion. The trap was nearly ready to spring. Chapter 5: The Dancing Flame. As the night wore on, Poirot observed how each guest responded to the mounting tension. Mrs. Harrington had taken to pacing the length of the drawing room, her theatrical gestures becoming more pronounced with each pass. Dr. Blackwood sat hunched in his chair, repeatedly checking his pocket watch as if time itself might provide an escape from their predicament. Captain Fortescue maintained his military bearing, but Poirot noticed how his eyes kept darting toward the windows, calculating distances and exit routes. Only Miss Pemberton remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes missing nothing. It was she who noticed what the others had overlooked. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "there's something about the candles that troubles me." The detective's attention sharpened immediately. "Indeed, please elaborate." "When we moved to the drawing room, I noticed that one of the candles from the dining room table had been extinguished. Not by the wind from opening doors, the others remained lit. But one specific candle had been deliberately snuffed out." Mrs. Harrington stopped her pacing. "What possible significance could that have?" "Consider, madame," Poirot replied, his eyes bright with interest. "A dinner party lit by candlelight creates very specific patterns of illumination. Remove one candle, and the shadows shift dramatically. Someone familiar with the room's layout might use such knowledge to their advantage." Dr. Blackwood frowned. "You're suggesting that the killer extinguished the candle before the electrical failure?" "I am suggesting that our murderer was very careful to ensure that Lady Ashworth would be standing in precisely the right spot when the lights failed. Near the sideboard, away from the table, isolated in a pocket of darkness that someone had created deliberately." Miss Pemberton nodded slowly. "The missing candle was the third one from the left. Extinguishing it would have cast the area by the sideboard into shadow, while leaving the rest of the table well lit." "Fascinating," Captain Fortescue said dryly. "But how could anyone predict that the electricity would fail at exactly the right moment?" Poirot smiled with grim satisfaction. "An excellent question, mon capitaine. Tell me, who arrived first this evening?" The guests exchanged glances. Mrs. Harrington spoke first. "I believe Edmund and I arrived together, just after 7. And I came perhaps 10 minutes later," Captain Fortescue added. "Julia and Lady Ashworth were already here, of course." "Which means," Poirot continued smoothly,
that someone had opportunity to examine the house's electrical system before the other guests arrived. The fuse box, for instance, is located in the cellar. A simple matter, to loosen a connection or create a minor short circuit timed to activate when the system was under load. Dr. Blackwood's face had grown pale. You think someone sabotaged the electrical system? I think someone planned this evening very carefully indeed. They knew the house's layout, they understood how the lighting affected the shadows, and they ensured that the power would fail at exactly the right moment. Mrs. Harrington resumed her pacing, more agitated now, but that would require intimate knowledge of Lady Ashworth's habits, her household routines, her electrical system. Precisely, madame, which narrows our field of suspects considerably. Miss Pemberton spoke up again, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. There's something else about the candles. In my notes from previous visits, I recorded that Lady Ashworth always lit the dining room candles herself. She considered it a personal touch that shouldn't be left to the servants. And tonight, Poirot prompted. Tonight, when we gathered for dinner, the candles were already lit. Lady Ashworth seemed surprised, even a bit annoyed. She mentioned that the staff had taken liberties, but she didn't want to make a scene in front of her guests. The implications settled over the room like a shroud. Someone had been in the dining room before the guests assembled, someone who had lit the candles and strategically extinguished one to create the necessary shadows. Captain Fortescue cleared his throat. I say, this is all very clever theorizing, but where's your proof? You can't convict someone based on candle wax and electrical speculation. No, Poirot agreed mildly, but such details create a pattern, and patterns, mon ami, often reveal truth. He moved to the fireplace, where the dying embers cast a warm glow across his features. Let me share another observation. When we examined Lady Ashworth's body, the emerald necklace was broken, its stones scattered across the floor. She must have caught it on something when she fell, Dr. Blackwood suggested. Or someone broke it deliberately to suggest a robbery gone wrong. But here is the curious thing. I counted the emeralds. 23 stones on the carpet, exactly matching the number that should have been in the necklace. If this were truly a robbery, would the thief not have taken at least some of the stones? Mrs. Harrington stopped pacing entirely. What are you implying? I am implying that someone wanted us to believe this was about money, about the emeralds, about Lady Ashworth's financial difficulties. But the true motive lies elsewhere entirely. The clock chimed 1:30, and outside the storm showed signs of abating. Dawn was still hours away, but Poirot could sense that the truth was drawing closer with each passing moment.
The killer made one crucial error, he announced quietly. In all their careful planning, they overlooked one small detail, and that detail, mes amis, will prove their undoing. The assembled guests waited in tense silence, each wondering if they were about to be accused of murder, while Poirot prepared to spring the trap that would reveal Lady Ashworth's killer. Chapter 6. The Truth in Wax. The fire had burned down to glowing embers when Poirot finally rose from his contemplation and moved to the centre of the room. His small figure commanded attention despite his unassuming appearance, and even Mrs. Harrington had ceased her restless pacing to watch him. Mes amis, he began, his accent more pronounced in the gravity of the moment. We have spoken much tonight of candles and shadows, of electrical failures and broken emeralds. But murder, true murder, is always about human passion, love, greed, fear, revenge. The mechanical details are merely the stage dressing for the real drama. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew the small piece of candle wax he had found earlier. In the lamplight it gleamed like a pearl against his palm. This small bit of wax tells us much. It is soft, recently melted, and coloured with a distinctive blue tint. Most interesting of all, it fell not near the dining table where the candles burned throughout our meal, but near Mrs. Harrington's chair. The actress drew herself up with theatrical dignity. I've already explained that I never left my seat during the electrical failure. Indeed you have, madame. But wax does not lie, and neither do the laws of physics. For this wax to have reached your chair, it must have dripped from a candle that was carried there. Miss Pemberton leaned forward, her notebook forgotten. You're saying someone brought a candle to Mrs. Harrington's place, not to her place, mademoiselle, but from it. Observe the blue tint of this wax. It comes not from the white dinner candles, but from the blue votive candles that Lady Ashworth kept in her private chapel, candles that were blessed by the Archbishop himself when her husband died. Dr. Blackwood frowned. The chapel, but that's in the East Wing. No one went there tonight. Someone did, Doctor. Someone who knew where to find those special candles. Someone who needed a source of light that would not be missed from the dining room. You see, our killer did not navigate in complete darkness as we have assumed. They carried their own illumination. Captain Fortescue shifted uncomfortably. This is all very interesting, but how does it identify the murderer? Poirot smiled grimly. Patience, mon capitaine. The wax tells us more. Notice how it has embedded within it small fibers, silk fibers to be precise. The killer carried this candle pressed against their clothing, hiding its light until the crucial moment. He moved to Mrs. Harrington's chair and knelt beside it, examining the Persian carpet with his magnifying glass. And here we find additional evidence. See these slight scorch marks. Someone held a candle very close to this spot, close enough to singe the carpet's edge. Mrs. Harrington's face had gone ashen. You're making wild accusations based on a bit of wax and some carpet burns. This is ridiculous. Is it, madame? Then perhaps you can explain why your evening bag contains a pair of small silver scissors, scissors that match the ones missing from Lady Ashworth's sewing basket. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Miss Pemberton spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. The scissors, you used them to cut the candle to size, didn't you? The chapel candles are taller than the dining room holders. Precisely, mademoiselle. But our killer needed more than just a hidden candle. They needed to ensure they could find Lady Ashworth in the dark, strike quickly, and return to their seat before the emergency lanterns were lit. Dr. Blackwood was staring at Mrs. Harrington with growing horror. Vivian, surely you can't have. The truly clever touch, Poirot continued relentlessly, was the rehearsal. Someone had practiced this routine, timing each movement, measuring each step. The killer knew exactly how many paces from the chapel to the dining room, exactly where Lady Ashworth would be standing when the lights failed. Captain Fortescue found his voice. How could anyone predict her movements so precisely? Because they had observed her habits over many visits. Lady Ashworth always rang for the next course at the stroke of 9. She always stood in the same spot by the sideboard to reach the bell. Our killer counted on this predictability. Mrs. Harrington finally spoke, her voice hoarse with emotion. You don't understand the situation. Margaret was being blackmailed. She was going to lose everything, including her reputation. I was trying to save her from scandal. Ah, Poirot nodded sadly. Now we approach the truth. Tell us about these Tuesday evening telephone calls, madame. Someone had discovered Margaret's affair with a married member of Parliament, an affair that ended 20 years ago but would have destroyed both their reputations if revealed. They demanded money, increasingly large sums. Miss Pemberton's pen moved swiftly across her notebook. The payments explain the investment losses. Lady Ashworth wasn't the victim of poor financial advice. She was being systematically extorted. Dr. Blackwood's face was a mask of anguish. Good God, if I had known, I would never have pressured her about my own losses. But you see the impossible position, Mrs. Harrington continued, her composure finally cracking. Margaret was going to confess everything to the authorities. She planned to expose the blackmailer even if it meant destroying herself. I couldn't let her throw her life away for the sake of honesty. So you decided to throw it away for her, Poirot observed quietly. But murder, madame, is not salvation. It is merely the end of all possibilities for redemption. The grandfather clock chimed 2, and outside, the first faint light of dawn was beginning to show through the storm clouds. Soon the constable would arrive, and justice would begin its inexorable march. But for now, in the drawing room of Willow House, the truth hung in the air like incense, bitter and inescapable. Mrs. Harrington collapsed into her chair, all pretense finally abandoned. She was going to ruin everything, not just herself, but the MP and his family. 3 children who would have grown up with their father's shame hanging over them. I couldn't let that happen. So you planned her murder, Poirot said with quiet finality. You studied her routines, learned the layout of Willow House, and devised a plan that would seem like an accident in the darkness. It should have worked, she whispered. Margaret always dismissed the servants early on Tuesday evenings because of those dreadful calls. I knew she would be alone in the dining room at exactly 9 o'clock. I had loosened the electrical connection in the cellar during my previous visit, just enough to create a failure when the system was under load. Miss Pemberton looked up from her frantic note-taking. You brought the blue candle hidden in your evening bag. While we were all chatting before dinner, you slipped away to the chapel, then positioned yourself back at the table. The extinguished dinner candle created the perfect shadow, Mrs. Harrington continued, as if compelled to confess every detail. When the lights failed, I lit my hidden candle, crept to where Margaret was standing, and struck her with the candelabra. Then I scattered the emeralds to suggest robbery, snuffed out my candle, and returned to my seat. But you made one critical error, Poirot observed. In your haste to return the blue candle to your bag, you allowed wax to drip onto the carpet, and in pressing the candle against your silk dress to hide its light, you left fibers embedded in the wax. Dr. Blackwood buried his face in his hands. All this time I thought I was responsible for Margaret's troubles. The guilt has been eating away at me. Your investment advice may have been unfortunate, Doctor, but you are not a murderer. That distinction belongs to Mrs. Harrington alone. Captain Fortescue stood and moved toward the window, where the first pale light of dawn was now clearly visible. The storm is breaking. I can see lights in the village. The constable should be here soon. Mrs. Harrington laughed bitterly. How ironic. I committed murder to prevent a scandal, and now I'll be the cause of an even greater one. The newspapers will have a field day with this. Perhaps, Poirot said gently, but Lady Ashworth will be remembered as a victim, not a fool. There is some justice in that. Miss Pemberton closed her notebook with a decisive snap. I shall ensure that the true story is told properly. Mrs. Harrington was my employer, but Lady Ashworth deserves better than to have her memory tainted by lies. The sound of horses' hooves could be heard approaching through the morning mist. The constable had arrived at last, bringing with him the machinery of justice that would transform this night of secrets into a matter of public record. As they waited for the official world to intrude upon their private tragedy, Poirot reflected on the waste of it all. A woman dead, another bound for the gallows, and a secret that had already caused so much pain finally brought into the harsh light of day. The blackmailer, he asked quietly, do you know their identity? Mrs. Harrington shook her head. Margaret never told me. She said it was better if I didn't know. Then that mystery at least dies with her, Captain Fortescue observed. Perhaps, Poirot murmured, that is for the best. Some secrets are better left buried with the dead. The grandfather clock chimed 2:30, marking the end of the longest night any of them would ever experience. Outside the storm had finally broken, and morning was coming to Willow House at last. Chapter 7. The Morning After Truth. Dawn arrived at Willow House like a reluctant witness, pale and hesitant through the tall windows that had watched over the night's tragedy. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a crystalline clarity that seemed to illuminate every shadow where secrets had previously hidden. Constable Williams arrived with the measured tread of rural authority, his uniform still damp from the ride through the dying storm. Behind him came Dr. Morrison from the village, summoned to provide official certification of death, and Sergeant Hartley from the county police, whose presence transformed the drawing room from a place of private grief into the scene of official inquiry. Poirot observed with professional interest how the atmosphere changed with the arrival of authority. Mrs. Harrington, who had confessed with theatrical drama in the intimate setting of their night-long vigil, now seemed to shrink into herself, the reality of her situation finally penetrating the fog of her rationalization. "I'll need statements from everyone," Sergeant Hartley announced, settling his considerable bulk into one of Lady Ashworth's delicate chairs with obvious discomfort. "Starting with whoever discovered the body." Dr. Blackwood raised a trembling hand. "That would be myself, Sergeant. I'm the family physician." "Was the family physician. I pronounced Lady Ashworth dead after examining her." "And the circumstances of discovery?" Poirot stepped forward with quiet authority. "If I may, Sergeant, the circumstances are somewhat complex. Perhaps it would be beneficial if I provided a summary of the evening's events before individual statements are taken." The sergeant looked skeptical until Constable Williams whispered something in his ear about Poirot's reputation. The expression shifted to one of grudging respect mixed with curiosity. "Very well, sir, but I'll want everything official and proper afterward." For the next hour, Poirot methodically reconstructed the evening's events, presenting each piece of evidence with the precision of a master craftsman assembling a delicate timepiece. The blue wax, the silk fibers, the extinguished candle, the sabotaged electrical system, each detail fell into place with inexorable logic. Miss Pemberton proved invaluable, her notebook providing exact times and precise observations that corroborated Poirot's deductions. Her professional training as a secretary had prepared her well for the role of witness, and her testimony was delivered with calm authority that impressed even the skeptical sergeant. "And Mrs. Harrington has confessed to this murder?" Sergeant Hartley asked, his pencil poised over his official pad. "In the presence of witnesses, yes," Poirot confirmed, "though I suspect she may attempt to recant once the full implications become clear." Mrs. Harrington stirred from her stupor. "I won't deny what I've done. Margaret was my oldest friend, and I killed her, but I did it to save her from a greater tragedy." "That's for the courts to decide, ma'am," the sergeant replied with professional neutrality. "Constable Williams, you'll need to take Mrs. Harrington into custody." The formalities of arrest proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Mrs. Harrington submitted to the handcuffs with resigned dignity, though Poirot noticed how her hands shook as the metal closed around her wrists. "Monsieur Poirot," she said as Constable Williams prepared to escort her away, "will you do something for me?" "If it is within my power, madame. Find the blackmailer. Margaret died because of their greed, and I killed her because of their threats. Someone else bears responsibility for this tragedy." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "I shall consider your request, madame." After Mrs. Harrington's departure, the remaining guests provided their formal statements. Captain Fortescue described the evening's tensions with military precision, while Dr. Blackwood's account was colored by obvious guilt over his role in Lady Ashworth's financial difficulties. Miss Pemberton's statement was the most comprehensive, her notebook having captured details that the others had missed or forgotten. Her professional objectivity served the investigation well, providing a timeline of events that supported Poirot's reconstruction perfectly. "Will you be staying in the area, sir?" Sergeant Hartley asked Poirot as the official proceedings concluded. "We may need additional testimony for the inquest,"
Certainly, Sergeant. I am staying at the Swan Inn in the village, though I hope to conclude my own inquiries before the formal proceedings begin. Dr. Morrison had completed his examination of Lady Ashworth's body, confirming Dr. Blackwood's assessment of the cause of death. The scene in the dining room was photographed and documented, the silver candelabra wrapped carefully as evidence. As the officials departed with their prisoner and their paperwork, an oppressive silence settled over Willow House. The servants who had been questioned and dismissed went about their duties with the subdued efficiency that tragedy brings to a well-ordered household. Captain Fortescue lingered in the drawing-room, staring out at the garden where morning mist rose from the rain-soaked earth. 40 years I've known this family, he said quietly. Served with Margaret's husband in India, watched her grow from a shy bride into a confident hostess. To think it would end like this. Dr. Blackwood had aged visibly overnight, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his perceived culpability. If I hadn't given her such poor investment advice, none of this would have happened. She wouldn't have been vulnerable to blackmail. Perhaps not this blackmail, Poirot observed gently, but secrets have a way of finding their price, Doctor. Lady Ashworth's vulnerability lay not in her financial situation but in her past. The blackmailer merely exploited what already existed. Miss Pemberton was packing her belongings, her employment with Mrs. Harrington obviously terminated by circumstances. I'll return to London on the morning train, she announced. There's nothing more I can do here. On the contrary, mademoiselle, Poirot said thoughtfully, I believe your work here has only just begun. If you are willing, I would like to engage your services for a few more days. She looked up sharply. To do what? To help me find a blackmailer. Chapter 8. The Web of Secrets. The library of Willow House had always been Lady Ashworth's sanctuary, a room where she had retreated with her correspondence and private thoughts. Now, with the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows, it served as Poirot's temporary headquarters as he began the delicate task of unravelling 20 years of carefully guarded secrets. Miss Pemberton had proven invaluable in this endeavour. Her secretary's training made her exceptionally skilled at organising documents, and her knowledge of Mrs. Harrington's investigation into Lady Ashworth's affairs provided crucial context for what they discovered. The telephone records from the exchange are quite revealing, she reported, consulting a ledger she had retrieved from the village post office. The Tuesday evening calls came from London, always from the same exchange in Westminster. That narrows the field considerably. Poirot examined the neat columns of numbers with satisfaction. Excellent work, mademoiselle. Westminster suggests someone with access to government offices or parliamentary buildings. Combined with Mrs. Harrington's reference to a member of Parliament, we begin to see a pattern, Doctor. Blackwood had remained at Willow House, ostensibly to handle the medical aspects of Lady Ashworth's death, but clearly reluctant to leave the scene of the tragedy. He entered the library carrying a tea tray, his hands still trembling slightly. I've brought refreshments, he announced, though his voice lacked conviction. The cook thought you might need sustenance for your work. Most thoughtful, Doctor. Please join us. Your knowledge of Lady Ashworth's recent behaviour may prove helpful. The physician settled into a leather armchair, his medical bag never far from his side. I keep thinking there must have been signs I missed, warnings that Margaret was in trouble, but she was always so composed, so self-contained. Yet she consulted you about legal matters, Miss Pemberton observed, looking up from her notes. Questions about wills and inheritance under duress. That suggests she was planning some course of action. She was, Dr. Blackwood confirmed heavily. The day before the dinner party, she asked me to provide a written assessment of her mental competence. She wanted it on file with her solicitor in case anyone questioned her decisions. Poirot leaned forward with interest. What sort of decisions required such documentation? She planned to make a full confession to the authorities about the blackmail, but more than that, she intended to reveal the identity of her former lover, despite the damage it might cause to his family. The implications hung in the air like dust motes in the afternoon sunlight. Miss Pemberton's pen scratched across her notebook as she recorded this crucial information. A desperate decision, Poirot murmured, the action of someone who had reached the absolute limit of endurance. Tell me, Doctor, did she mention receiving any communications other than the telephone calls? Dr. Blackwood frowned in concentration. Now that you mention it, yes, she had been receiving letters, typewritten letters with no return address. They came irregularly, perhaps once a month. She always burned them immediately after reading, but surely the postmarks would indicate their origin. London postmarks, I believe, but Margaret was most secretive about them. She never left them lying about where the servants might see them. Miss Pemberton made another note. The pattern suggests escalation, monthly letters followed by weekly telephone calls, increasing the pressure systematically. Indeed, our blackmailer was quite methodical in their approach. Poirot rose and began pacing the length of the library, his hands clasped behind his back. But consider this curious fact. The blackmail ceased abruptly 3 weeks ago. No more Tuesday calls, no more letters. Why? Dr. Blackwood shook his head. I have no idea. Margaret seemed relieved at first, but then she grew more agitated than ever. She said the silence was worse than the demands. Because silence suggested a change in strategy, Poirot observed. Perhaps the blackmailer had decided that Lady Ashworth was no longer profitable, or perhaps they had found a more effective means of pressure. A knock at the library door interrupted their discussion. Captain Fortescue entered, his military bearing intact despite the strain of the past 24 hours. Forgive the intrusion, he said formally, but I've had a visitor from London, a Mr. Pembroke from Lady Ashworth's solicitors. He has some rather urgent information about her affairs. The solicitor proved to be a thin, nervous man who clutched his briefcase as if it contained state secrets. His revelation, when it came, cast an entirely new light on their investigation. Lady Ashworth contacted our firm 2 weeks ago, Mr. Pembroke explained, adjusting his spectacles nervously. She wished to add a codicil to her will, leaving a substantial sum to a charity for the families of military personnel killed in service. A charity? Miss Pemberton looked puzzled, but her finances were in such difficulty. That's precisely the point, miss. The bequest was to be funded by the sale of her emerald necklace, the very necklace she wore to her final dinner party. She was adamant that this provision be added immediately. Poirot's eyes glittered with sudden understanding. And did she indicate why this particular charity was important to her? Mr. Pembroke consulted his notes. She mentioned that she wished to make amends for an old wrong, something about a family that had suffered because of choices made long ago. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with startling clarity. Lady Ashworth's blackmailer hadn't been a stranger exploiting her secrets. They had been someone with a personal stake in her past, someone who felt they deserved compensation for old injuries. Mr. Pembroke, Poirot asked quietly, did Lady Ashworth specify which family would benefit from this bequest? She did indeed. The charity supports the widow and children of a Major Thomas Whitmore, killed in action in France in 1917. The silence that followed was profound. Outside, the afternoon birds sang their usual songs, oblivious to the human drama unfolding within the library walls. Major Whitmore, Captain Fortescue repeated slowly. I knew him, served under me in the 3rd Battalion. His widow remarried some years ago, to a rising young politician. Poirot finished softly, a member of Parliament who has been very careful to keep his wife's first marriage out of the public eye. The web of secrets was finally becoming clear, and at its center sat a spider who had been weaving their trap for 20 long years. Chapter 9, The Spider's Web. Evening shadows stretched across the gardens of Willow House as Poirot prepared to spring his carefully constructed trap. The past 24 hours had yielded a treasure trove of information, and now all the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into their proper places. Miss Pemberton had proven herself invaluable as an investigative assistant, her secretarial skills perfectly suited to the methodical unraveling of long-buried secrets. She sat across from Poirot in the library, her notebook filled with names, dates and connections that painted a picture of betrayal spanning 2 decades. The pieces fit together almost too perfectly, she observed, reviewing her notes. Margaret Ashworth's affair with a married MP 20 years ago, the tragic death of Major Whitmore in France, his widow's remarriage to that same MP, and now the systematic blackmail that led to murder. Indeed, Poirot agreed, his green eyes bright with satisfaction. But consider the most revealing detail of all. The blackmail stopped precisely when Lady Ashworth decided to make her confession and establish the charitable bequest for Major Whitmore's family. Dr. Blackwood, who had insisted on remaining at Willow House until the mystery was resolved, looked up from his medical journal with confusion. I don't understand the significance, think, mon ami. Who would have known about Lady Ashworth's intention to make this bequest? Who would have realized that their secret was about to become public knowledge anyway? Captain Fortescue entered the library at that moment, carrying a telegram that had just arrived from London. His face was grim as he handed it to Poirot. Your inquiries have borne fruit, he announced. The Metropolitan Police have been most cooperative. Poirot scanned the telegram quickly, his expression growing more serious with each line. As I suspected, the Honourable James Whitmore, MP for East Surrey, has been making increasingly desperate attempts to raise capital over the past month. His creditors are becoming impatient, and his political career hangs in the balance. Miss Pemberton's pen flew across her notebook. James Whitmore, he must be Major Thomas Whitmore's son, but how does that connect to the blackmail? Consider the timeline, mademoiselle. Major Whitmore dies in France in 1917, leaving behind a pregnant wife and substantial debts. The widow, desperate for security, accepts the proposal of a rising politician who promises to care for her and her unborn child. Dr. Blackwood was beginning to understand. The child grows up believing his stepfather is his real father, taking his name and following him into politics. Precisely, but secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when money becomes tight. Young James Whitmore discovers his true parentage and realizes that his father's career was built partly on a scandal involving Lady Ashworth. The perfect material for blackmail. Captain Fortescue frowned, but surely the statute of limitations would have expired on any criminal charges. An affair 20 years ago, even if it contributed to the Major's distress before his death. Criminal charges, yes, but political scandals, mon capitaine, have no statute of limitations. A member of Parliament's career can be destroyed by revelations of ancient adultery, especially if that adultery contributed to a war hero's death. The library door opened to admit the housekeeper, Mrs. Jenkins, who announced that a visitor had arrived from London. A Mr. James Whitmore, sir, says he has urgent business regarding Lady Ashworth's estate. Poirot smiled with grim satisfaction. How convenient. Please show Mr. Whitmore in, and ask him to wait in the drawing room. We shall join him presently. As the housekeeper departed, Poirot turned to his companions with quiet intensity. Now we shall see how a cornered spider reacts when the web begins to collapse around him. James Whitmore proved to be a handsome man in his early 30s, with the polished bearing of a successful politician and the nervous energy of someone under considerable stress. He rose as they entered the drawing room, his practiced smile not quite concealing the strain in his eyes. Monsieur Poirot, I presume. I've come as soon as I heard about poor Lady Ashworth's tragic accident, such a terrible loss to our community. Indeed, monsieur, though I fear it was no accident. Mrs. Harrington has confessed to murder, claiming she acted to prevent Lady Ashworth from exposing an old scandal. Whitmore's composure flickered for just a moment. How dreadful. I had no idea Margaret was involved in anything scandalous. Did you not? Yet your telephone calls to her every Tuesday evening suggest otherwise. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Whitmore's political training served him well, but Poirot's experienced eye caught the minute signs of panic, the tightening around the eyes, the almost imperceptible tensing of the shoulders. I'm afraid there's some mistake, Monsieur Poirot. I never telephoned Lady Ashworth. Miss Pemberton consulted her notebook with professional calm. The telephone exchange records show calls from Westminster 4729 every Tuesday at 9 o'clock for the past 6 months. That number is registered to your parliamentary office. Impossible. My secretary handles all my calls. Whitmore stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. Ah, but your secretary would hardly have conducted a blackmail scheme without your knowledge, Poirot observed mildly. Unless, of course, you are suggesting that your office staff are in the habit of extorting money from elderly ladies. The politician's facade was cracking like ice in spring sunshine. You don't understand the situation. Lady Ashworth owed my family a debt that went far beyond money. Indeed, please enlighten us. Whitmore began pacing the room with agitated energy. She destroyed my father's marriage, his peace of mind, his very will to live. He went to France as a broken man because of her selfishness, and he died there without ever knowing he had a son.
Dr. Blackwood spoke up quietly. Major Whitmore died fighting for his country, sir. That's hardly Lady Ashworth's fault, isn't it? She seduced a married man, drove him to distraction with her demands, and her threats to expose their affair. My mother told me everything before she died. How Margaret Ashworth nearly destroyed our family, and so you decided to destroy her in return, Poirot concluded, using her guilt over your father's death as a weapon to extract money and preserve your own political career. The confession, when it came, was delivered with the bitter eloquence of long-nursed resentment. Whitmore had discovered his true parentage through his mother's deathbed revelations, learning not only about Lady Ashworth's affair with his father, but also about the financial pressures that had driven Major Whitmore to seek dangerous assignments in France. She owed us, he insisted with desperate conviction. Every pound I took from her was justice for what she stole from my family. But Poirot knew that justice and revenge were very different things, and that the web of lies surrounding this tragedy had claimed far more victims than anyone had intended. Chapter 10. The Final Candle. The autumn rain had returned to Willow House, drumming against the windows with the same relentless rhythm that had provided the soundtrack to Lady Ashworth's final evening. In the drawing-room where the dinner-party guests had once waited in tense silence, Poirot now sat with the remaining threads of the mystery, finally woven into a complete tapestry of human folly and tragic consequence. James Whitmore had been taken into custody by Sergeant Hartley, his political career effectively ended by his confession to 6 months of systematic blackmail. The revelation that both victim and blackmailer were now beyond the reach of earthly justice brought no satisfaction to anyone present, only a profound sense of waste that seemed to permeate the very atmosphere of the house. Miss Pemberton sat by the window, her notebook closed for perhaps the first time since arriving at Willow House. The efficient secretary had proven herself a natural detective, her methodical approach and keen observations having been instrumental in unraveling the complex web of secrets that had led to murder. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Harrington," she said quietly, watching the rain streak down the glass. She genuinely believed she was saving Lady Ashworth from scandal and disgrace. Dr. Blackwood, who had aged visibly over the past 2 days, nodded heavily from his chair by the fireplace. The road to hell, as they say. Vivian always had a flair for the dramatic, but I never imagined she was capable of murder. Desperation, mon ami, can drive even the most civilized person to savage acts, Poirot observed, his voice tinged with the sadness that comes from seeing too much of human nature's darker impulses. Mrs. Harrington saw her oldest friend being systematically destroyed and believed that murder was the only solution. Captain Fortescue had remained at Willow House to handle the practical arrangements for Lady Ashworth's funeral and estate. His military training had prepared him well for dealing with logistics in the aftermath of tragedy, though even his disciplined composure showed signs of strain. "The irony is that Margaret had already found her own solution," he said, consulting a letter that had arrived that morning from Lady Ashworth's London solicitor. "This confirms what we suspected. She had arranged to make a full confession to the authorities next week. The blackmail would have ended, and James Whitmore would have faced prosecution. But Mrs. Harrington was unaware of this plan," Miss Pemberton noted. "She acted on incomplete information, believing that murder was the only way to prevent scandal." Poirot rose from his chair and walked to the mantelpiece, where photographs of the Ashworth family gazed down with the serene dignity of people whose secrets had died with them. "The tragedy, Miss Amise, is that all of this suffering was ultimately unnecessary. Lady Ashworth had found the courage to face the consequences of her past. James Whitmore would have been exposed and punished through legal channels. Justice would have been served without bloodshed." The grandfather clock chimed 5, its deep tones echoing through the house that had witnessed so much sorrow. Outside, the early darkness of autumn was settling over the gardens where Lady Ashworth had once walked while contemplating the difficult decisions that had led to her death. "What will happen to the house?" Dr. Blackwood asked, voicing the practical concern that follows tragedy like a shadow. Captain Fortescue consulted another document. "Margaret left everything to a trust for military widows and orphans, rather fitting considering the circumstances. The house will be sold, and the proceeds will fund the charity she had planned to establish." "Including the emeralds?" Miss Pemberton inquired. "Yes, though they're being held as evidence until the trials are concluded. Mrs. Harrington will face charges of murder, while young Whitmore will answer for blackmail and extortion." Poirot turned from his contemplation of the family photographs. "And what of you, mademoiselle? What are your plans now that your employment with Mrs. Harrington has ended so abruptly?" Miss Pemberton managed a small smile. "I've had an interesting offer, actually. Mr. Pembroke, Lady Ashworth's solicitor, has asked me to help establish the charitable trust. It seems my experience with this case has given me unique qualifications for the position." "An excellent outcome," Captain Fortescue approved. Margaret would have been pleased to know that something positive emerged from this tragedy. As the evening wore on, the remaining occupants of Willow House prepared for their final night in the place that had brought them together under such terrible circumstances. Dr. Blackwood would return to his practice in the village, carrying with him the burden of guilt over his inadvertent role in Lady Ashworth's financial difficulties. Captain Fortescue would oversee the practical arrangements before returning to his own estate in Kent. Miss Pemberton had already begun organizing the documents that would be needed to establish the charitable trust, her methodical nature finding purpose in creating something constructive from the ruins of the tragedy. And Poirot, the little Belgian detective, sat in the library, writing his final report on the case that had begun with a dinner party and ended with the exposure of a 20-year-old scandal that had claimed multiple victims across 2 generations. "The candles," he murmured to himself as he wrote, thinking of the blue wax that had provided the crucial clue to Mrs. Harrington's guilt. "Always it comes back to the candles, sources of light that can illuminate truth or create the shadows where deception hides." As midnight approached, Poirot completed his report and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Scotland Yard. The official investigation was essentially concluded, but the human cost would continue to reverberate through the lives of everyone touched by the tragedy. Lady Margaret Ashworth had taken her secrets to the grave, but not before their exposure had destroyed a blackmailer's career and driven a friend to murder. Mrs. Vivian Harrington would spend her remaining years in prison, paying the price for a misguided attempt at salvation. James Whitmore faced ruin and prosecution, his political ambitions reduced to ashes by his own greed and resentment. In the morning, they would all leave Willow House behind, carrying with them the memory of how quickly human lives could be destroyed by the weight of old secrets and the desperate measures people took to protect or exploit them. But tonight, in the drawing room where 6 dinner guests had once gathered in the warm glow of candlelight, only the shadows remained, silent witnesses to the truth that murder, like the flickering flames that had illuminated it, left nothing but darkness in its wake. The candles of Willow House would never burn again. Thus concludes our tale from the archives of Hercule Poirot's cases, another reminder that in the world of detection, the smallest details often cast the longest shadows. This has been Stephen, your narrator for Cozy Mysteries, hoping you've enjoyed this journey into the darker corners of human nature. Until our next mystery, remember the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully someone tries to snuff it out.